Imagine you've got this brilliant employee, right? Like someone who's just been a top performer for years.
Right, the rock star of the team.
Exactly. But over the last 3 months, their performance has just completely tanked. I mean, they're missing deadlines. They seem totally disconnected in meetings, and the tension in the office is just, it's palpable.
Yeah, you can cut it with a knife.
So your immediate instinct, because you're a capable leader who gets things done, is to pull them into a room and give them this highly structured 5-step action plan to get back on track.
Of course, the classic management response.
Right. You identify the problem, you build the framework, you hand them the roadmap, they nod, they leave the room, and absolutely nothing changes.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, they might even retreat further. So what just happened? Like, why did that entirely logical, rational management technique fail so spectacularly?
Well, it failed because you treated a human being like a broken machine. You assumed that because you could see a drop in productivity, you automatically understood the root cause of that drop. And you assumed that a mechanical linear sequence of steps could just repair it.
Right, like replacing a part in an engine or something.
Exactly. And we're so conditioned to operate this way. We really love the fix-it reflex. We see a symptom, we prescribe a solution, and we just want to move on.
It feels productive.
It does. But human psychology, especially when we're talking about professional growth and personal transformation, it actively rebels against that kind of forced external solutioning.
And that dynamic, the total failure of the fix-it reflex and the desperate need for, frankly, an entirely new way to talk to each other, that's the foundation of our deep dive today.
It really is.
We're exploring the mechanisms of a completely different paradigm, drawn directly from Jedediah Alex Coe's groundbreaking work, Lead with Clarity, the Architecture of Conversational Mastery.
A phenomenal text.
It is. Specifically, we're going to tear down the traditional linear coaching models that they've dominated boardrooms for the last 40 years.
Long overdue, honestly.
For sure. Our focus is the lay coaching model. We're unpacking chapters 16 through 21, which detail exactly how presence and structure combine to create a space where co-creative, nonlinear transformation actually happens. Okay, let's unpack this.
So the fundamental shift we're discussing here is moving from a mentality of executing a formula to inhabiting an architecture.
Executing a formula to inhabiting an architecture.
Okay. Think about the models that most corporate leaders and coaches are trained on. The gray model is probably the most famous, goal, reality, options, will.
Yeah, everyone learns gray.
Exactly. But it's inherently linear. It assumes a predictable, stable environment where if you just logically walk someone through those 4 steps, they'll arrive at a neat, tidy resolution.
Like a math equation.
Precisely. But applying a rigid linear model like grow today is, well, it's like trying to navigate a magnetic storm with a cheap compass. The environment itself has fundamentally changed.
Right, and Coe frames this environmental change using a concept that completely recontextualizes why these old models feel so clunky right now. The BNI world.
Yes, BANI.
Right, it's an acronym developed by futurist Jamais Cascio. Brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. Let's actually look at what that means for just a simple conversation.
It changes everything.
It does. When we say the world is brittle, we're talking about systems that look incredibly strong on the surface, but can shatter literally overnight. Supply chains, legacy companies, even established career paths.
Exactly. And because the environment is brittle, the people operating within it are naturally anxious. That's the A.
So everyone's just walking around on eggshells.
Basically, yeah. There's this pervasive ambient dread. You never quite know when the ground is going to shift beneath you. And then you add the nonlinear aspect, the N. Cause and effect are no longer proportionate. A single misunderstood email or like a 10-second viral video can destroy a 20-year career. The inputs just do not match the outputs anymore.
Which naturally leads to the final letter, right? Incomprehensible.
Incomprehensible.
The sheer volume of data, the complexity of global interconnectedness, it's just too much for the human brain to process.
We simply aren't wired for it.
So if an executive comes to you and they're overwhelmed trying to navigate a brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible landscape, and you sit down and say, okay, let's establish your goal, look at your reality, list your options, and solidify your will, it's almost insulting.
It really is. It forces a chaotic reality into an artificially sterile box.
Yeah.
And this is exactly why the premise of the lead model is that effective coaching must be co-creative and nonlinear. It actively rejects what calls auteur direction.
Auteur direction, like in movies. Super.
Exactly. In cinema, the auteur is the director who controls every single frame, every lighting choice, every line of dialogue. The actors are just, well, meat puppets hitting their marks.
That's a great image.
Right. But in traditional management, the leader plays the auteur. They think they have the ultimate vision, and their job in a conversation is to manipulate the employee into seeing their brilliant solution.
Right. They're just directing the scene to get the outcome they already decided on.
Precisely.
Like,
But Lair strips the coach or the manager of that auteur status. Instead of handing you a script, LED provides an architecture.
I want to linger on this metaphor for a second because it completely changed how I view conversation. Like, a formula is a set of tracks, right? A train can only go in one direction. But an architecture is a room. It has walls, a floor, a ceiling. It provides safety and boundaries. But once you are inside the room, you can walk anywhere you want.
You can pace, you can sit, you can look out the window. Exactly. And that architecture only comes alive through the instrument of the coach.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, the architecture of a concert hall is a perfect parallel here. You can have the most brilliantly engineered symphony hall in the world with perfect acoustic paneling and flawless reverb.
The best money can buy.
Right. But if the hall is empty, it's just silent architecture. It requires the musician, the instrument, to step onto the stage and create the sound.
Oh, gee.
Conversely, you can take a master violinist, someone who has practiced for 40 years, and put them in a poorly designed concrete basement.
And it sounds terrible.
Exactly. Their brilliance will be completely swallowed by the terrible acoustics. Neither works alone.
So the mastery of conversation then is the integration of both. You need the acoustic perfection of the LED framework, but you also need the profound human presence of the coach to play the music.
That is perfectly said.
But, learning to play that music, to actually inhabit that architecture, it isn't something you just read in a book and execute flawlessly the next day. There's a deeply psychological progression to mastering this.
There really is, and Ko draws on the Japanese martial arts concept of shuhari to explain it.
Shuhari.
Yes. It's a developmental pathway for anyone trying to master a complex skill. Shu translates roughly to protect or obey. When you're first learning the LED architecture, you're in the shu phase. You consciously, deliberately follow the phases. You might literally have a cheat sheet of questions on your desk.
Right. It feels a bit clunky, maybe a little artificial.
Yeah, because you're consciously protecting the form of the architecture. You're learning where the walls of the room are so you don't walk into them.
Makes sense. And then what's the next step?
Then, as you build muscle memory, you enter the ha phase, which means detach or digress.
Ah, okay.
You understand the underlying principles of the architecture so well that you start to adapt it. You bend the rules slightly because you know why the rules exist in the first place.
You're finding your own voice.
Exactly. You start to find your own voice within the structure. And then there is
The final phase.
Yes. Re means leave or transcend. This is the realm of true conversational mastery. At this stage, you aren't thinking about the framework at all. You aren't mentally checking off boxes or trying to remember what phase comes next.
It's just muscle memory.
More than that, you have internalized the architecture to such a degree that your responses are intuitive. You might sit in complete silence for 3 minutes, or you might abandon a line of questioning entirely because the conversation demands it.
You transcend the form.
Yes, while perfectly expressing its essence.
I have to push back on this progression, though. I'm struggling with the practical application of re.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we're telling leaders and coaches to eventually abandon the linear steps, right, to just flow naturally and transcend the form, how do we prevent the conversation from devolving into total chaos? Because if traditional linear coaching is like a GPS rigidly forcing you to the fastest route, and a maid is more like exploring a new city with a local guide, I love the freedom of that.
Sure.
But if I'm the local guide and I let the client explore whatever side street they want, how do I prevent a 45-minute venting session about how much they hate their boss?
Right.
There has to be a boundary. Otherwise, it's not a productive coaching session. It's just complaining at a coffee shop.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the core friction of nonlinear coaching. How do you maintain purpose without imposing rigidity?
Exactly.
The answer lies in the 5 laws of the LED model. These laws are the orienting principles that govern that local guide you mentioned. They're the gravity that keeps the exploration from floating off into the vacuum of space.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, for instance, the law of co-creation dictates that neither person in the room holds all the wisdom. The insight does not exist solely in the coach's head, and it doesn't exist fully formed in the client's
It
head.
has to be built together.
Right. It emerges entirely from the friction and connection between the two.
So if a client starts ranting about their boss for 20 minutes, the law of co-creation would be violated because the client is just dumping data
Right.
and the coach is just passively absorbing it. There's no co-creation happening.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And another critical guardrail is the law of recursive depth.
Recursive depth.
Yes. This law acknowledges the psychological reality that human growth is not a straight line ascending a mountain. It's a spiral.
The spiral.
Think about it. A client might come to you with an issue regarding time management. You work through it, they have a breakthrough, they improve.
Right.
But then 6 months later, they come back with what looks like the exact same time management issue.
Oh, I've seen that happen so many times.
Right. Now, a linear model would say, we failed. The fix didn't work. Start over.
But the law of recursive depth says we are just encountering the same theme at a deeper level of complexity.
Precisely. Last time, time management was about learning to use a calendar. This time, time management is about their profound inability to set boundaries because they tie their self-worth to pleasing others.
Oh, wow. So it's the same side street, but you are noticing completely different architecture because the lighting has changed.
I love that. Yes. These laws ensure that the architecture remains a container for growth, not a playground for chaos. And to truly understand how that container is built in real time, we have to look at the very first movement of any meaningful conversation. The L in lead.
Lead outcomes.
Yes.
This is the gravity of clarity. And what fascinated me is that it fundamentally dismantles the way almost every corporate meeting or coaching session begins.
Totally.
The standard opening is usually some variation of what do you want to achieve today? Or what's the goal? Which, seems incredibly efficient.
Yeah.
But Co argues that this traditional goal setting is actually a trap.
It is a massive trap because it operates on a deeply flawed assumption.
Which is?
It assumes the person sitting across from you actually knows what they want, and it assumes they have the self-awareness and psychological safety to articulate it out loud.
Which they almost never do.
Exactly. When you ask a stressed executive, what is your goal, their brain immediately defaults to the most socially acceptable, metric-driven answer available.
I want to improve cross-functional communication by 20%.
Exactly. And the linear coach hears that and says, perfect, let's build an action plan for cross-functional communication.
And then they spend 6 weeks working on communication frameworks, and the executive is still miserable, still underperforming, and the tension in the office hasn't changed at all.
Why? Because cross-functional communication wasn't the actual problem, it was a surface-level symptom.
Right.
Skipping the deep exploratory work of lead outcomes creates what Co calls the aimless session. The coach and the client are working incredibly hard, digging a massive hole, but they are digging it in the completely wrong place.
Lead outcomes changes the central question entirely. Instead of asking, what do you want? It asks, what matters most right now and why?
That why is crucial.
It forces the conversation to slow down and hunt for the keystone outcome.
The keystone outcome.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's visualize a stone archway. You have all these blocks of stone curving up, but at the very top center is the keystone. It's wedge-shaped. It is the single stone that holds the tension of the entire structure.
Exactly.
If you pull the keystone out, the whole arch collapses. If you secure the keystone, everything else locks into place.
That's a perfect visual. The keystone outcome is the underlying psychological or operational truth that, if addressed, makes all the other surface-level goals irrelevant or easily solvable.
But finding that keystone requires serious conversational architecture.
Yeah.
Co maps this out in 5 distinct movements.
Yes, he does. And it's crucial to note that these aren't just questions you ask in rapid succession like an interrogation.
Right.
They are distinct psychological spaces you have to navigate.
Okay, let's walk through those 5 movements because this is where the theory really hits the pavement.
Let's do it.
Movement 1 is the opening invitation. It's not a demand for a goal. It's a broad, welcoming clearing of the space, like where should we begin today, or what's been taking up the most space in your mind lately.
Exactly. It lowers the defensive barriers immediately. Then you move into movement 2, exploring the landscape.
Exploring the landscape.
Right. This is where the client will usually just dump a massive pile of puzzle pieces onto the table. They'll talk about budgets, a rude email from a vendor, their lack of sleep, a looming deadline, just everything.
And the coach's job here is not to pick up a puzzle piece and start trying to fix it.
Exactly. The job is simply to map the terrain.
So you might say, you've mentioned the budget, the vendor, and your exhaustion. That's a lot of terrain.
Perfect. Which naturally leads into movement 3, Discovering relevance. This is where we actually start looking for that keystone.
Discovering relevance. So this is about attaching emotion and weight to the data.
Yes. You ask things like, of everything you just laid out, what carries the heaviest emotional weight for you right now? Or, why does this specific deadline feel different than the others? You're looking for the heat.
There's a fantastic case study in the book that brings these first three movements to life perfectly. The story of Wei Lin.
Oh, Wei Lin. Yes, that's a powerful one.
She's an executive who comes to her coach with a very specific tactical request. She says she needs strategies for managing her boss.
A very common request.
Right. Her boss is demanding, micromanages, and sends late-night emails.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm a novice coach, my fix-it reflex screams, let's role-play boundary-setting conversations. Let's draft an email template you can send when he emails you at 10 p.m.
Oh, absolutely. That's the trap.
Yeah.
But the masterful coach applying Lade restrains that reflex.
Right.
During the exploring the landscape phase, the coach just listens to Wei Lin talk about her boss. But during the discovering relevance phase, the coach notices a discrepancy.
What was the discrepancy?
Well, Wei Lin is a highly competent executive who negotiates multi-million-dollar contracts daily. She clearly knows how to set boundaries.
Oh, right.
So why is she paralyzed by this one individual? The coach asks, what is about his late-night emails that feels so insurmountable?
And that's when the architecture does its job. Wei Lin pauses, and she realizes that it isn't about the email itself. It's about what the email represents.
Exactly.
She admits that every time he questions her work, it triggers a deep-seated fear that she's an imposter. She feels like a fraud who somehow tricked her way into the executive suite, and she's terrified that her boss is finally going to expose her.
That is the keystone.
Wow.
The surface-level goal was manage my boss. But the keystone outcome is address my imposter syndrome and fear of exposure.
That's a totally different conversation.
Completely. If the coach had spent 6 weeks teaching her email management techniques, they would have completely failed her. She would have still felt like a fraud, just a fraud with a better out-of-office reply.
That is so true.
By finding the keystone, they enter movement 4, clarifying the lead outcome and the gap. They define exactly what the work is going to be about.
And finally, movement 5, establishing shared agreement. They formally agree, okay, our focus today isn't your boss's inbox, it's your internal narrative about your own competence. Are we aligned on that? Here's where it gets really interesting for me. We operate under this myth that to ask for coaching or guidance, we have to arrive with a perfectly articulated problem.
Which is so unfair to the client.
It is, but realizing that I'm not sure what's wrong, I just know something is off, is valid data that changes everything. Sometimes finding the focus is the entire focus of the session.
It redefines productivity entirely. You know, in a corporate culture obsessed with KPIs and deliverables, spending an entire hour just figuring out what to talk about feels, well, inefficient.
Like you're wasting time.
Right. But it is the ultimate efficiency. Solving the wrong problem takes months of wasted energy. Finding the right problem might take an hour of deep architectural conversation.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
And the psychological safety this creates cannot be overstated. When Wei Lin and her coach establish that shared agreement, they draw a boundary around the conversation.
She knows what to expect.
Wei Lin knows exactly what they're going to discuss and, just as importantly, what they are not going to discuss. She isn't going to be ambushed. That boundary allows her to drop her armor and venture into vulnerable territory.
So we've established the keystone outcome. We know the destination, or at least the true nature of the journey.
Right.
The next structural requirement is to figure out exactly where we're starting from. We have to map the current reality with brutal honesty. And that brings us to the first E in lead. Examine.
Examine, yes.
Yeah.
This is the space of grounded inquiry. It's the deliberate, patient articulation of reality without rushing to judge it, defend it, or solve it.
Which is so hard to do.
Incredibly hard. And the architecture provides a specific mechanism for doing this effectively, the two-lens framework.
The two-lens framework, okay.
See, when a client is describing their current reality, they're usually blurring facts and feelings into one chaotic narrative. The coach must separate them using the problem lens and the person lens.
Let's unpack those lenses. The problem lens seems fairly straightforward. It's the external architecture of the situation.
Yes, exactly. The problem lens is objective. What are the facts? Who are the stakeholders involved? What is the budget? What is the hard deadline? What are the structural constraints of the organization?
It's just the forensic accounting of the situation.
Right. If a manager is dealing with a toxic team dynamic, the problem lens looks at turnover rates, project delays, and formal HR complaints.
But if we stop there, we're just managing a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
That's where the person lens comes in. This is the subjective reality. How is the client experiencing the problem?
The person lens requires looking at the internal ecosystem. What are the client's beliefs about this toxic team?
Mm.
What are their assumptions about their own leadership capability? What are their fears? Where are they feeling the stress physically in their body?
Wow, physically in their body. That's deep.
The fundamental principle of the examine phase is that you cannot solve the problem until you understand how the person is relating to the problem.
Because the person is the instrument that has to execute the solution. If their internal ecosystem is paralyzed by fear, the most brilliant external strategy is completely useless.
100%.
But this is exactly where the fix-it reflex rears its ugly head again. Let's look at the psychology of why we rush to solve things. When a colleague sits across from you, looks exhausted, and says, "My team is falling apart, I'm failing, I can't sleep," they are projecting immense discomfort into the room.
They are. And human beings are biologically wired to alleviate discomfort.
Right.
When you hear a baby cry, your nervous system spikes, and you want to soothe it. When your colleague expresses pain, your nervous system spikes. You feel their anxiety.
So you throw a solution at them. Have you tried restructuring the weekly sync? Have you read this book on delegation?
Exactly. And here's the kicker. You aren't actually trying to help them. You were trying to self-soothe.
Wait, really?
Yes, you want them to stop being in pain so that you can stop feeling uncomfortable.
Wow. We fix to self-soothe. That is a brutal realization for anyone in leadership. We wrap our anxiety in the guise of being helpful.
It's a bitter pill to swallow.
But the masterful coach, the one inhabiting the restage the architecture, resists that biological urge. They sit in the discomfort. They let the client's painful reality hang in the air, and they examine it.
They hold the space.
It reminds me of a medical triage. You don't just throw painkillers at a patient screaming in the ER. You have to physically examine the wound, clean the debris out of it, and understand how deep it goes, even if examining it causes more temporary pain.
This raises an important question, though. That's an apt analogy, but a common critique of this phase, and one that novice coaches struggle with, is the fear that examine will devolve into a wallowing session.
Right. I was just thinking that.
If we're just staring at the pain, mapping the constraints, and looking at their fears, aren't we just reinforcing their victimhood? How do we prevent them from drowning in the mud of their current reality?
That is exactly the friction right there.
Yeah.
How do you look at the dark without turning off all the lights?
You do it through a skill Coase calls emergent attention.
Emergent attention.
Right. The coach is a mirror, not a sponge. A sponge passively absorbs the dirty water until it is saturated and useless. A mirror reflects reality back to the client so they can see it objectively.
Okay, that makes sense.
Emergent attention means the coach is dynamically tracking where the client's energy is flowing between the problem lens and the person lens, and actively intervening when they get stuck.
So if the client is obsessively rattling off external facts like, and then Jim said this, and then Sarah missed the deadline, and then the client emailed, they're hiding in the problem lens to avoid their feelings.
Exactly. They are using external data as a shield. Emergent attention notices that imbalance, and the coach gently redirects the mirror. You've given me a very clear picture of Jim and Sarah's actions, but I noticed your voice got very tight when you mentioned the client's email. What is the story you are telling yourself about your own responsibility in that failure?
You shift them to the person lens.
Exactly.
And vice versa. If they're just spiraling in self-pity, I'm a terrible leader, I ruin everything, everyone hates me, they are drowning in the person lens.
Right.
So the coach uses emergent attention to pull them back to the problem lens. Let's look at the actual evidence. What objective facts support the idea that everyone hates you?
You're illuminating the structure of their reality. You're casting light into the corners they've been avoiding. You aren't letting them wallow. You are demanding rigorous honesty about where they currently stand.
Because you cannot plot a course to a destination if you refuse to admit your true starting coordinates.
Exactly.
So once that reality is fully illuminated, once the wound is clean and we know exactly what we are dealing with, the heavy gravitational pull of the examine phase shifts. We've earned the right to pivot toward the future.
Yes, the energy changes.
We get to stop looking at what is and start exploring what could be. And this takes us to the second E in the architecture.
Explore and evoke.
Explore and evoke.
This is the expansive, creative heart of the lead model. If examine is about narrowing focus to define current reality, explore and evoke is about blowing the doors off the room to let new air in.
I love
And
that.
it's a dual movement, and distinguishing between the two words is vital. Explore is active. It's the testing of boundaries, the deliberate challenging of established narratives.
Okay, and evoke.
Evoke is receptive. It is the patient, spacious cultivation of silence to allow new insights to bubble up to the surface.
Let's start with the active part, explore. To facilitate this, the architecture provides a highly effective tactical tool called the EOCHO technique.
ECHO.
Elicit, connect, horizon, open. Let's run a hypothetical scenario through this technique to see how it forces the brain out of its rut. Let's imagine a tech founder who's severely bottlenecking her company because she refuses to delegate the final approval on product design.
A classic founder trap.
Totally. We've examined the reality.
Yeah.
She is exhausted, and the team is resentful. Now we need to explore.
Okay, so we start with elicit. We want to draw out the hidden assumptions. The coach might ask, what is the core belief you hold about what happens if you don't personally approve a design?
And she might answer, if I don't touch it, the product loses its soul and the company fails.
Right. That's a massive fatalistic assumption. So we move to C-Connect. We want to find patterns elsewhere in her life or business.
So the coach asks, where else in the business have you believed that your direct involvement was the only thing preventing failure, but you eventually handed it off successfully?
And she thinks and says, well, I used to do all the financial modeling myself, but we hired a CFO 2 years ago, and she actually does it better than I did.
Boom. The narrative just cracked. She proved her own assumption false.
Exactly. Now we go to H horizon. We expand the view to the macro level. If she's staring at a microscopic pixel, we force her to look at the Milky Way.
If you continue to be the sole bottleneck for product design for the next 5 years, what happens to your vision of taking this company public? You force her to see the consequence of her current reality on her ultimate keystone outcome.
And finally, open. You invite an entirely new paradigm. What would the architecture of this company look like if your design team was actually more capable than you?
So what does this all mean? That sequence, elicit, connect, horizon, open actively dismantles the scaffolding of her limiting beliefs. That is the essence of explore.
Yes.
Explore is like walking around a sculpture to look at it from every physical angle. You're tapping it with a hammer, listening for hollow spots.
But then we get to evoke, and this is where the magic and frankly the extreme discomfort for the coach truly happens.
Oh, yeah.
If explore is walking around the sculpture tapping it, evoke is sitting down on the bench in front of the sculpture, shutting your mouth and just staring at it until the artist's meaning suddenly clicks into place. Evoke is the mastery of silence.
Silence is profoundly misunderstood in Western professional culture. We view silence as a void. We view it as an awkward gap in the audio track that implies a lack of productivity.
Absolutely.
If two people are sitting in a boardroom for 60 seconds not speaking, someone is going to panic and fill the air with words.
Someone always breaks.
But in conversational mastery, silence is not empty. It's densely, heavily packed with cognitive processing. You used a phrase earlier when we were reviewing the research that I want to bring back here because it is such a vivid metaphor. Metabolic processing.
Yes. Metabolic processing.
When you ask that founder the open question, what if your team is better than you? And she goes completely silent and stares at the floor. What is actually happening in her brain?
She is literally metabolizing the question. Her brain is breaking down the protein of that new idea and attempting to build completely new neural pathways.
Wow.
It's searching her memory banks, testing the structural integrity of her identity, and running simulations of a future she has never allowed herself to imagine. It takes immense biological energy.
So if the coach gets nervous after 10 seconds of silence and says, or, maybe just start by delegating one small feature, what has the coach just done?
They have yanked the food right out of her mouth.
Ouch.
They've short-circuited the metabolic process. The client was on the precipice of a profound self-generated realization, and the coach's inability to manage their own anxiety about the silence robbed the client of their breakthrough.
It's tragic.
It is. To evoke requires what Co calls the courage to stay. You must have the discipline to sit in the silence and let the client's internal ecosystem do the heavy lifting.
It requires immense ego suppression from the coach. You have to be okay with not being the one talking. But when you hold that silence and the client finishes metabolizing, the silence breaks.
The energy shifts again.
The client's eyes widen, their posture shifts, and they articulate a completely new understanding of their reality. They have a breakthrough.
But a breakthrough is fragile. It's a spark. And a spark can very easily blow out the second they leave the room and check their email. For a realization to actually change behavior, it must be permanently integrated into their sense of self. It must become an A.
Aligned insights. This is the fulcrum of the entire lead model. And the most brilliant part of this phase is hidden in the grammar of the word itself.
Yes, I love this detail.
Aligned is a past participle. It ends in ed. It describes a state of being that has been achieved, not an action you are currently doing.
It is not the aligning insights phase. The coach is not grabbing the client's realization and aggressively hammering it into the framework of their life like a mechanic fixing a car.
No.
The coach's role is to bear witness to the alignment, to recognize it when the tumblers of the lock finally click into place, and to help the client consolidate that new state of being.
But how do we know it actually clicked? We've all had those massive epiphanies in the shower, right? Like, I need to quit my job and become a woodworker.
We've all been there.
And by the time we are drinking our morning coffee, the epiphany is gone and we're back to dreading our commute. An insight is cheap. How do we ensure it's an aligned insight?
The architecture provides a pressure testing mechanism for this, the 3-layer insight matrix. For an insight to achieve true alignment, it must be successfully passed through 3 temporal lenses.
Okay, what are they?
It must look backward, inward, and forward.
Let's use a story from the prelude of Coe's book to demonstrate this because it is incredibly moving. The story of Seth.
Seth's story is incredible.
Seth was the definition of corporate success. He had the corner office, the board seats, the wealth. But he sought out coaching because despite having everything he supposedly wanted, he felt entirely hollow.
Just empty.
Through the explore and evoke phase, Seth has a breakthrough. He realizes that his relentless drive for corporate dominance was never about the work. It was a desperately constructed mechanism to seek external validation to fill a childhood wound. He was using achievement to prove to himself that he existed.
A profound realization. But to make it an aligned insight, he must run it through the matrix. First, he looks backward. How did I get here? He has to trace the historical lineage of his behavior, recognizing how that childhood wound dictated his career choices for 20 years. This validates the origin of the insight.
Then the crucial layer, inward. What does this mean for who I am right now? This is where informational learning becomes transformational learning.
Exactly.
Informational learning is, I work too much. Transformational learning is, my identity as a ruthless corporate titan is a defense mechanism, and I no longer want to defend myself. It shakes the foundation of his values.
And finally, forward. How will I apply this? How does this changed identity alter my trajectory tomorrow?
Right, the practical application.
If he truly believes he no longer needs external validation, how does he interact with his board of directors next week? If the insight survives all 3 layers, if it makes sense of the past, shifts the present identity, and demands a new future, it is fully aligned.
Now, in the moment that Seth realizes all of this, there is a massive trap waiting for the coach. The text refers to it as the summary trap. Imagine I am coaching Seth. He has just done this incredibly heavy emotional lifting. He is piecing together the trauma, the ambition, the hollowness. It feels so incredibly helpful and, frankly, validating to my ego as a coach to jump in and tie it up with a bow for him.
It's so tempting.
To say, wow, Seth, so what I'm hearing is that your entire corporate persona was built to mask your insecurity, and now you want to dismantle that persona. Is that right? Why is that such a toxic move? I'm just proving I was actively listening.
What's fascinating here is you just stole his cognitive trophy.
Whoa.
You took the heaviest, most profound realization of his life and you articulated it for him. The summary trap robs the client of ownership.
That makes total sense.
When the coach names the insight, it is ultimately just advice. It's an external observation being handed to the client. But when the client labors to find the exact words, when they push the breath out of their own lungs to declare their new reality out loud, it physically wires into their nervous system.
When they name it, they own it.
Yes. The master coach creates the silence and the space for the client to stumble through the articulation until they find the perfect phrase themselves. You want the client to be the hero of their own realization.
Okay, so Seth has named it. He owns it. His insight is aligned. His identity has shifted. But internal work, no matter how philosophically beautiful or emotionally profound, is entirely invisible.
It's just thoughts.
Right. If Seth realizes he doesn't need external validation, but he goes back to the office and continues working 90-hour weeks and screaming at his VP of sales, the coaching session was just an intellectual exercise.
Completely useless in the real world.
The internal shift must cross the threshold into the physical world. We have to create momentum. And that brings us to the final phase of the architecture, the D's in land.
Decide and act. This is the integration of abstract awareness into concrete, intentional movement. And the word intentional is the fulcrum here. A massive mistake novice leaders make is assuming that any action is good action. But the lead model insists that the action must flow directly from the newly aligned insight. It cannot flow from panic, it cannot flow from a sense of corporate obligation, and it cannot flow from a desire to just check a box.
Because if it flows from obligation, it's just another to-do list that the brain is going to actively resist.
Exactly.
To understand why intentional aligned action works, Coe leans heavily on the modern science of behavior change. This isn't just motivational fluff, this is neurological reality.
It is. The text integrates several pillars of behavioral science. It utilizes Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions.
Okay.
Gollwitzer proved that simply deciding to do something is highly ineffective. You have to neurologically link the intended behavior to a specific environmental cue. When situation X arises, I will perform response Y.
Got it.
It also integrates B.J. Fogg's work on tiny habits, recognizing that massive, ambitious behavioral leaps trigger the brain's amygdala and cause resistance. Small, almost laughably easy actions bypass that fear response.
And James Clear's concept of identity-based habits. You aren't trying to read 20 pages a day, you are trying to become a reader. The habit is just evidence of the new identity.
Spot on.
To architect this evidence-gathering process, LED uses a specific protocol called the Go 6 Steps to Leap Forward. Let's rigorously test these steps. We don't want to just list them. Let's see how they prevent failure.
Let's apply it. Step 1 is insights to actioning. The coach asks, based on your realization today, what is the most aligned intention you can set? Notice we're moving from the abstract insight to a practical intention.
Then step 2, design actions. This is where Fogg's tiny habits come in. You don't say, I'm going to overhaul the entire corporate culture. You say, I'm going to start every executive meeting by asking one question and listening for 2 minutes without interrupting.
Exactly. Concrete and achievable. Step 3 is managing progress. How will you know you are actually doing this? You need a feedback loop.
Right.
Step 4 is accountability. Who or what is going to help you stay in this new identity when the old triggers arise?
Step 5 is threat and barriers. And I think this is where the magic really lives. Because usually, when we make a plan, we are operating in a state of high motivation. We imagine an ideal world where nothing goes wrong.
Which never happens.
Right. But step 5 forces you to pre-experience failure. When your VP of sales misses his quota next week and your anxiety spikes, what is going to stop you from reverting to your old behavior? Anticipating the barrier actually preloads a new neurological response.
It neutralizes the surprise of the obstacle. And finally, step 6, resources and support. What tools, time, or people do you need to execute this tiny action? It's a comprehensive stress test of the proposed behavior.
There's a story in the text about a hospital administrator named Marco that completely flipped my understanding of what constitutes an action.
Oh, Marco's story is brilliant.
We're conditioned to think of action as external productivity, right? Making a call, sending an email, drafting a report. Marco was utterly overwhelmed by his workload. Through the LED process, he realized his exhaustion wasn't a time management issue. It was a fear of inadequacy.
He was terrified of failing.
He was micromanaging every department because he was terrified that if a mistake happened on his watch, he would be exposed as incompetent.
He had an aligned insight. The root cause was his internal emotional regulation, not his external project management software.
Right, so when they reached the decide and act phase, the obvious linear corporate action would be, Marco, design an action plan to delegate 3 projects to your directors by Friday. But that's not what he did.
No, it wasn't.
His designed action was to sit in his office for 10 minutes every morning and journal about his specific fears of inadequacy for that day. His action was entirely internal.
And it was brilliant. If the coach had forced Marco to delegate those projects before Marco had integrated his new emotional reality, it would have been a disaster.
Complete chaos.
Marco would have delegated the projects, panicked about losing control, and then aggressively micromanaged his directors, creating even more exhaustion. The internal action journaling was the tiny, identity-aligned habit that built the foundation necessary for him to eventually delegate healthily.
It redefines what progress looks like in a corporate environment. But we have to address the dark side of the decide and act phase. The text warns about the overaction trap and the planning paradox.
Ah, yes.
I am personally so guilty of this. It's Sunday night, I get a burst of motivation, and I design an incredibly complex, flawless plan for my week. I'm going to meal prep, hit the gym at 5 a.m., write for 2 hours, and clear my inbox.
Sounds perfect on paper.
And by Tuesday at 9 a.m., the plan has completely collapsed and I am demoralized.
You fell into the planning paradox. In a Band-Aid world, remember, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible, excessive planning is actually a sophisticated form of procrastination.
Oof, that hurts.
It allows your brain to experience the dopamine hit of making progress without taking on any of the actual risk of execution. You feel productive because you made a beautiful color-coded spreadsheet.
But the spreadsheet hasn't changed reality.
Exactly. The lead model demands short cycles of action. You don't build a 6-month roadmap, you build a 2-day experiment.
A 2-day experiment.
You take one tiny aligned action, you execute it, and you see what happens. If it works, you have gathered evidence that your new identity is real. If it fails, the blast radius is tiny and you learn from it immediately. Small, rapid cycles of deciding, acting, and learning are the only way to navigate a nonlinear environment.
Okay. We have walked through the entire architecture. Lead outcomes, examine, explore and evoke, aligned insights, decide and act.
LEAD.
We've laid it out linearly, from L to D, which feels great. It makes for a very clean outline. But the central thesis of Coe's work, explicitly stated in chapters 8 and 22, is that human beings are fundamentally messy.
Extremely messy.
We do not grow in straight lines.
Mm-hmm.
So if we treat add like a rigid checklist, we are just creating a new, fancier version of the grow model.
That is the ultimate paradox of the architecture. You must learn the structure perfectly so that you can abandon it gracefully.
Right.
The lead model is a living system. It yields to the reality of the human in front of you. And to map this messy reality, Coe details 5 non-linear movements that a master conversationalist will use to navigate the architecture: the spiral, the loop, the leap, the pause, and the return.
Let's dissect how these actually look in the room, because this is where the stage of mastery really shines. Let's talk about the leap.
Imagine you are in the examine phase with a client. You are meticulously mapping the current reality of a conflict they're having with their co-founder. You're looking at the problem lens, the equity split, the voting rights.
Just going through the facts.
Suddenly, mid-sentence, the client stops. Their eyes widen. They have a massive, spontaneous realization. They leap directly past explore and evoke straight into an aligned insight. Oh my God, I am fighting with my co-founder over equity because I am terrified he's going to abandon the company just like my last partner did.
The insight just arrived unprompted.
Exactly. Now, a novice coach, trapped in the shoe phase, clinging to the checklist, would panic. They'd think, wait, we haven't done the echo technique yet. I haven't asked my brilliant open-ended questions.
Right?
So the novice coach says, that's an interesting thought about abandonment, but let's go back and explore what would happen if the opposite were true.
Which is conversational malpractice. You just drag them away from their own epiphany so you could check a box.
It is infuriating for the client. The master coach recognizes the leap. They instantly abandon the examine phase and teleport to the aligned insight phase to meet the client where they are. They help consolidate the insight right there.
That is so powerful.
Or consider the opposite movement, the loop. You are at the very end of the session. You are in Decide and Act. You are mapping out the Jigo 6 steps for a client who wanted to secure a massive promotion.
Okay.
But as they are designing the actions, their energy flatlines. They look miserable. They say, you know, looking at all this work required to be the VP, I don't think I actually want the job. I think I just wanted the validation.
Wow. The keystone outcome just shattered.
Yes. A linear coach pushes through. Well, we agreed on this goal. Let's finish the action plan. A master coach executes the loop.
They go back.
They gracefully loop all the way back to the beginning, to lead outcomes. Okay, the promotion isn't the true keystone. What matters most right now and why? They start over without any frustration because the realization that they were chasing the wrong goal is a massive success.
To explain this fluidity, this ability to leap and loop without losing structural integrity, Coe introduces a philosophy called Mizu coaching, or the way of water. It's a brilliant metaphor for conversational agility.
Water is the ultimate nonlinear force. It adapts perfectly to whatever container it's poured into, yet it retains its fundamental nature.
Right.
In a coaching conversation, the practitioner must flow like water. Sometimes water is a clarifier, a perfectly still pool that acts as a mirror during the examine phase, showing the client their own reflection without distortion.
Sometimes it's a solvent. During Explore and Evoke, the gentle, persistent drip of curious questions slowly dissolves. Fixed, hardened perspectives, just like water carving through limestone over thousands of years.
And sometimes, when an insight is aligned and action must be taken, water is a driving force. It is the kinetic energy of a river cutting a new channel into the landscape. Flowing through the lead phases requires the coach to constantly change their state, from still mirror to dissolving solvent to driving force based entirely on what the client needs in that exact second.
Throughout this entire deep dive, I keep coming back to a different analogy. It feels like a jazz ensemble.
Oh, I like that.
When you listen to a master jazz quartet, you have a chord progression, and that is the lead framework. It's the underlying structure that everyone agrees upon so the song doesn't collapse into noise. But the actual magic, the music that gives you goosebumps, happens in the improvisation. It happens when the saxophone player listens intensely to a weird rhythm the drummer just threw in, and instead of ignoring it to play their pre-written solo, they lean into it, they flow with it, they loop, they leap, they pause.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the architecture, and it highlights why lead is not just a niche tool for executive coaches. It is a scalable philosophy of leadership for the future.
It scales to anything.
You can use the lead architecture for a 3-minute hallway conversation with a junior designer who is stuck on a wireframe. You quickly establish the lead outcome, examine the block, explore an alternative, and decide on a tiny action.
And you can use the exact same architecture for a 3-day intensive retreat with a board of directors trying to navigate a merger.
The chord progression scales. It represents the necessary evolutionary leap from managing by telling to leading by co-creating.
Let's take a breath and survey the incredible terrain we've covered today. We have fully traversed the architecture of conversational mastery.
We really have.
We've seen how rushing to solutions fails catastrophically in a brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible world. We learned why finding the true lead outcome provides the necessary gravity for everything that follows.
Yes.
We saw how Examine demands rigorous, mirrored honesty about current reality without the self-soothing reflex to fix it. We explored how Explore and Evoke expands the mind, and how the courage to hold silence allows for deep metabolic processing.
So crucial.
We learned that aligned insights must look backward, inward, and forward to fundamentally shift identity, and why we can never steal the client's words. And finally, how Decide and Act turns that internal shift into tiny, identity-proving momentum in the real world, all while flowing gracefully through the nonlinear loops and leaps of human growth.
It is a profoundly human framework. It respects the chaotic reality of the individual while providing the structural integrity necessary to facilitate genuine, lasting transformation.
It changes everything about how you look at the person sitting across from you. And we want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to metabolize on your own. Go for it. We've spent this entire deep dive rigorously examining the structure of the conversations we choose to have. We've talked about how to architect them, how to inhabit them, how to flow through them like water.
Right.
But consider the inverse. What about the conversations you are actively avoiding? Think about the emotional residue of the unsaid words you carry in your own invisible backpack every single day. The feedback you are afraid to give, the boundary you are terrified to set, the vulnerability you refuse to show.
Wow.
Coe's premise is clear. The quality of our conversations determines the quality of our lives. So what is the heavy compounding cost of the conversation you are refusing to architect right now?
That is the ultimate keystone question.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. The next time you sit down with someone, whether it's a struggling employee, a visionary co-founder, or your own partner, remember the architecture. The human mind is not a broken machine you can just point at and fix with a 5-step plan. So don't step into that space with a rigid formula. Step into it with genuine, co-creative presence. See you next time.